Is it just me, or has the college football season just flown by? It's always like that for me every year. We're already at the point of the season where the playoff poll is out. And what a lot of people don't realize is that there's no rules, criteria, or standards when the playoff committee comes together and comes up with this poll. Like, say, championships. You're not required to win your conference championship. Wins and losses, it's all subjective. So it's always interesting to see how especially the first poll looks whenever it comes out, to see what they're thinking. It's not going to reflect how the end of the year is going to look, but it just gives us a starting point. The thing about this first playoff poll is a lot of people watch this, and you had some people who are ready to jump off a cliff because they were so wrong, or scratching their heads, or whatever the reaction is, extreme reactions. Calm down, folks. This is the first playoff poll, and it is done by humans, so it is going to be subjective. So I wanted to look at what the playoff committee came up with. To me, this first poll doesn't really matter. It just doesn't matter, okay? But we're going to look at it anyways. 10 through 1, they have, at number 10, Florida. 9, Oklahoma. 8, Utah. 7, Oregon. 6, Georgia. 5, Clemson. 4, Penn State. 3, Alabama. 2, LSU. And 1, Ohio State. So I looked at their top 10, and I decided to do my own top 10. And it looks a little bit different, and I actually have reasons why mine looks different over the playoff committees. First things first, their number 10 is Florida. I do not have Florida in my top 10. The reason is, well, they barely beat a bad Miami team, and that was with the help of a picked up flag. Barely beat a terrible Kentucky team. Beat a bad South Carolina team with a lot of help from the refs. Everybody agrees on that one. That was severely tilted in the favor of the Gators. They do have one quality win against Auburn, and not a lot of people are going to agree with me on this next comment. They lost to an overrated and mediocre Georgia. Now, for Florida, their remaining schedule is versus Vanderbilt. They get Vanderbilt at home, at Missouri, and then they get a terrible Florida State team at home. So that's why I don't have Florida in my top 10. So who do I have in my top 10? Let's look at it. For my number 10 team, I have Michigan. Yep, I have Michigan. Now, the big thing about Michigan is, yes, they were beat very, very convincingly by Wisconsin, but Wisconsin is a good team too. And I was debating on whether to put them in my top 10 poll. But a loss to Illinois, not going to do it. So, yes, they had a huge blowout loss to Wisconsin. But then they barely lost to a Penn State team. And then whooped a decent Notre Dame team. And also beat a decent Iowa team. Their remaining schedule is, they get Michigan State at home. They have to go to a terrible Indiana, and then they get Ohio State at home. Whenever they got blown out by Wisconsin, I was already thinking ahead, thinking, here we go again. They're going to get blown out by Ohio State at the end of the year. Jim Harbaugh, he could get fired, which he still could. But as of late, they're looking pretty competitive. I give them a chance to win that ball game, especially it being at home. So my number 10 team is Michigan. Then we go on to number 9. I dropped Georgia from 6 to number 9. Here's why. They barely beat a decent Notre Dame team. See what I did there? Michigan, my 10 team. Georgia, my 9 team. Michigan whooped Notre Dame, and Georgia barely beat Notre Dame. Both of those were home games for Georgia and Michigan. So I dropped Georgia down to 9. The main reason is they lost to a bad South Carolina team. That should not have happened. It was an ugly game, and it was at Georgia. That bad loss knocked them down to number 9 for me. And also, this goes back to the Florida thing. A lot of people want to give Georgia credit for beating a good Florida team, and Florida a lot of credit for barely losing to a good Georgia team. I'm the reverse. I don't think Florida is a very good team. They did have that decent win at Auburn, so Georgia barely beat a mediocre Florida team. Here's what Georgia's remaining schedule looks like. They get Missouri at home, at Auburn. That's going to be a tough one. They get Texas A&M at home, and then they go to a terrible, terrible Georgia Tech squad. So they're not totally out of it. They're going to need some help. They need to go to Auburn and have a very good game. Not only win, but win convincingly. Get to the SEC Championship and beat whoever's remaining from that LSU-Alabama showdown. So if they can do that, yes, they will get in the playoffs. But as of right now, I don't see them doing that. I still think Auburn's going to beat Georgia at Auburn. That's a tough place to play, and Auburn's a pretty decent team. So we will see how that goes for Georgia. Now we go on to the number 8 team, and Oklahoma. That's who I have there. Let's see their credentials. They beat a mediocre Texas team, lost to a decent Kansas State team. That shocked me. But the thing is about that Kansas State game is Kansas State was blowing them out, and then Oklahoma somehow made it a game, and it came down to a onside kick, which they almost got. It was ruled, in their favor at first, but review showed that it touched an Oklahoma player. So they are an onside kick away from being undefeated. Their remaining schedule is Iowa State at home. They go to Baylor, who is undefeated, but they really haven't played anybody. They get TCU at home and then at Oklahoma State. So Oklahoma is not out of it yet. That Kansas State game did hurt them. But the thing is, they could get another crack at Kansas State. Kansas State could end up being the number 2 team in the Big 12, and Oklahoma would get a chance to redeem themselves in the Big 12 championship, which is what happened last year. They got beat by Texas and got to play Texas again, beat them, got into the playoffs. So Oklahoma by no means is out of the playoff race. Now for my number 17. 7 and 6, 6 and 7, they directly correlate to each other, and it's based on one team, and it's what I'm about to mention. Number 7, Utah. And here's the team that correlates 6 and 7 to me. For Utah, the reason I put them at number 7 is they lost to a mediocre USC team. They did whoop a mediocre Washington State and also beat mediocre Arizona State and Washington. So it's that USC loss that has them down to number 7 and under the number 6 team, which I'll mention here in a second. Their remaining schedule is UCLA at home, at Arizona, versus Colorado. So whenever I look at that, to me it looks like Utah has a straight path towards the Pac-12 championship. If they can get there with one loss and beat whoever comes out of the North, which I don't want to give away number 6, but I think you know where I'm going there. If they can beat whoever comes out of the North with one loss and be the Pac-12 champs, they have a strong case to get into the playoffs, especially with that defense. Utah has a top 5 defense. So now we move on to the number 6 team. This is what I was talking about. Number 6 for me is Oregon. What I mentioned about Utah is they lost to a USC team. Now, it wasn't by much, but it was a loss. Oregon beat USC. They also beat Washington and Washington State. So those are some decent wins. And their only loss is to a decent Auburn team. So that's not a bad loss. And it was the first game of the season. So if you're going to lose, that's when you want to lose. You want to lose at the beginning of the season. And that's what Oregon did. And that's why I have them at number 6. Also, their remaining schedule is They get a bad Arizona team at home. They do have to go on the road to Arizona State and then come back for Oregon State. And that's the team from the Pac-12 North that I was talking about that Utah could end up playing. That would be a great championship game. If Oregon and Utah, if both of them can get to the Pac-12 championship game with one loss, and then whoever wins that game, that would look great on their resume. That gives them an excellent chance to get into the playoffs. So I'm hoping that both Utah and Oregon can get through the season with just one loss, play each other, and we will see how that goes. That will be very exciting if that happens. All right, here we go. My number 5 team. I have Alabama. I know, I'm going to hear it. But here's why. I have reasons, okay? Alabama's my first undefeated team to pop up on my top 10 as the number 5. Like I mentioned, they're undefeated. But really, their best win is against a average at best Texas A&M. The reason I have them at number 5 is the Tua situation. He's still questionable. Don't know if he'll be 100%. This doesn't mean they don't have a chance at the playoffs. Like I said, the first poll really doesn't matter that much because things are going to get flipped around, switched around. People are going to beat people. People are going to knock people out. People are going to jump up. So, it doesn't really matter that much. But the reason I have Alabama number 5 is because of that Tua situation. And as of right now, Alabama doesn't have any notable wins. None. People are shocked about that. They just don't. Do they have a chance to finish the season with notable wins? Oh, yeah. Because this is their remaining schedule. They get LSU at home, at Mississippi State, versus Western Carolina, and at Auburn. So, getting LSU at home, and then at the end of the year at Auburn, those are the 2 big statement wins that Alabama needs, especially LSU. If they can beat LSU, they are in very good shape. Not that they're in bad shape right now, but they'll be in better shape, and we'll see about the Tua situation. Moving on to number 4, Clemson. And the reason I have Clemson above Alabama is they seem to be doing what they do every year. At the second half of the season, they just get better and better and better. And we all know that their schedule looks like crap, but all they do is win. They beat a mediocre Texas A&M team, which is the same as Alabama. They survived a scare from North Carolina. They had to escape because of a failed 2-point conversion, but they did win that game, and that's all that matters. And like I said before, no other notable wins. And their remaining schedule at NC State, which NC State looks terrible this year, but it is at NC State, and NC State always plays Clemson well. After the NC State game is probably the best chance for Clemson to come up with a big-time win before the season's over with, before the ACC championship, and that is Wake Forest, and they do get them at home. Wake Forest has a great offense. I think right now they're sitting at 1 loss, if I'm not mistaken. I'm pretty sure. So they'll get Wake Forest at home, and then after that, of course, the rivalry with South Carolina. This year, it's in Columbia. South Carolina's bad, but they did go into Georgia and beat Georgia, and that's why I knocked Georgia all the way down to number 9. Let's move on to number 3. LSU. LSU, they've looked pretty good, undefeated. They've beaten mediocre teams in Texas and Florida, and they also beat an Auburn team who is pretty good. But other than that, nothing really jumps out except for that explosive offense. And it's looked really good this year, especially Joe Burrow. The thing that kind of makes me second guess LSU is their defense. We have to see if they can, stop Alabama, because that's who they have next. Their remaining schedule is at Alabama. Now, if that game was being played in Baton Rouge, I'd probably say LSU by a touchdown, maybe 10 points. But it's at Alabama. And we don't know if Tua is going to be 100% in that game. So that's a toss-up in my head. Then they also get at Ole Miss. And then the last 2 games, they get terrible Arkansas at home and average at best Texas A&M at home. So if they can get by Alabama, you're looking at an undefeated LSU team going into the SEC championship and probably going to be taking on Georgia. And if they can get by Georgia, they will definitely be headed to the playoffs as an undefeated SEC champion. We're going to move on to number 2. My number 2 team is Penn State. And I know that's shocking a lot of people, scratching your heads. Why Penn State? Here's why. They're undefeated, of course. But they have decent wins over Pitt, over Iowa, and over Michigan. And they flat out destroyed Michigan State. Penn State has looked good. Now, they almost let Michigan come back and beat them. But let's not forget, Michigan is looking pretty good in the second half of this season. So that counts as a good win now. So they have 3 pretty good wins and then a blowout over a, average Michigan State. It's a lot more than most people can say. And their remaining schedule is at Minnesota, which right now, yes, Minnesota's undefeated, but they haven't played anybody. So this will be a big-time test for Minnesota. It will be at Minnesota, so I'm sure the place will be rocking. We'll see how Penn State does there, but for right now, I have them at number 2. After the Minnesota game, they get lowly Indiana at home. And then huge game at Ohio State. That's going to be a massive game. Ohio State looking really good, and it's going to be at Ohio State. So we'll see what happens between now and then. And then they finish off the season with Rutgers at home. Should be a blowout, no problem. So will it be Penn State or will it be Ohio State to represent the Big Ten East? I'm not sure. That brings me to my number 1 team. Ohio State. This team is a complete team. They look good on offense and they look good on defense, and they just flat out have dominated their schedule. They whooped Cincinnati, who has turned out to be a pretty good team. They whooped Wisconsin, pretty good team. And they also whooped average at best Michigan State. Michigan State has had a decent defense at times this year. That's why I keep mentioning Michigan State. One word for Ohio State this year so far: domination. They have dominated their schedule. And it's not all cupcakes, and it's not all easy wins and easy this and easy that. They just have flat out dominated their competition. Now, this last stretch for Ohio State is probably going to be their toughest part. They have Maryland at home at Rutgers. All right, that is cake. But after those 2 games, they get Penn State at home and then at Michigan. Like I said before, don't sleep on that Ohio State-Michigan game now. Michigan is looking a whole lot better than they were at the beginning of the year. They are starting to figure it out on offense and keeping the defense intensity up where it needs to be. So that Ohio State-Michigan game, that's going to be something to watch as well. And the thing for me, though, is, we have, 7 undefeateds left. We got Ohio State, we have Penn State, we have Clemson, Alabama, LSU, Baylor, and Minnesota. So I wanted to look at the last 2 undefeated teams that are not in the top 10, but they're undefeated, so they still technically have a chance. The first team I'm going to look at is Baylor, who is ranked number 12. I don't have them ranked. I'm going by the playoff rankings on these 2. So Baylor is ranked number 12. They're undefeated. They did beat a Kansas State team, a decent Kansas State team, who beat Oklahoma. So that's a good win for Baylor. However, two scares for Baylor. They barely survived Iowa State, and they barely survived West Virginia. Both were bad teams. Yes, I'm a West Virginia fan, but I'm honest, and I try to not be delusional. West Virginia is bad this year, and Baylor barely survived both of those teams. Here's the problem for Baylor. Their remaining schedule. They have at TCU. Doesn't seem that bad because TCU's at the bottom, but they're always tough to play when it's at TCU. Then they get Oklahoma at home and Texas at home. So I think that Oklahoma and Texas, those two games will really tell where Baylor actually is. And then their last game is at Kansas, which actually Kansas is not as bad as they usually are. They're not great. They're not good. They're just not as bad. So this is where we'll figure out where Baylor really stands, how legitimate they are, and see if they can make the Big 12 championship. Excuse me. The three teams I have still contending for the Big 12 championship is Baylor, Oklahoma, and Kansas State. So we'll see how that, gets figured out. And then, of course, the last team I'm looking at is Minnesota. I looked at their schedule. The only thing they have going for them is they're undefeated. They haven't played anybody. They haven't wowed anybody. They've just survived. That's about it. But now their remaining schedule, they get Penn State at home. That's going to be a tough one. At Iowa. Don't sleep on that game either. That's going to be a tough one too. At Northwestern. And then Wisconsin at home as well. So the two big ones, Penn State and Wisconsin, they do get at home. So that's going to be something to watch for, to see if they can pull off an upset against either of those two teams. I'm not sure. There's a reason why Minnesota's ranked number 17 right now, is they just haven't played anybody. But they're about to, so we'll all see and figure out how good Minnesota really is. Anyways, that's my take on the playoffs. That's my own top 10. Let me know what you think about it, and come back and see me in my next video. Appreciate it.